Welcome back. I'm Dr. Cheek and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And today we're going to talk a little bit about learned helplessness. Now, do you ever sometimes wonder why someone would stay in an adversive or painful or harmful situation, whether it's a relationship, whether it's at a work situation, whether it's family dynamics, and you are able to clearly see an outlet or a way for them to avoid that situation, but instead of avoiding it, they continue to put up with that negativity, that painful situation or that adverse situation? Have you ever experienced that, or do you ever wonder what's causing someone to continue to put up with that situation? One reason a person may continue to deal with that situation is due to learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is when someone repeatedly experiences adverse or harmful situations that are outside of their control. So learned helplessness is defined as a person's inability to act to avoid harmful or painful situations because they believe that regardless of what they do, regardless of whatever action they take, it will not affect the outcome. The outcome itself is outside of their control. And learned helplessness has been implicated in certain mental health disorders like depression, but it's simplistic to attribute learned helplessness to depression. Learned helplessness can contribute to that feeling of hopelessness, which is a symptom of depression, but it's too simplistic to say learned helplessness is the cause for depression. But it has been seen as a contributing factor for depression. Now, where did learned helplessness come from? Learned helplessness came from an experiment that was done in the 60s. And this experiment was done on dogs, and they were using this to test conditioning or classic conditioning. I'm a behaviorist by nature, so I kind of love this stuff. So this particular experiment was really interesting to me. And what it was is that it was the initial experiment looked at 3 different groups. So there was a group of dogs that were not introduced to any type of shock. They were just allowed to live their happy little lives as dogs. Then there was a group that was introduced to inescapable shocks. So they would get shocked to the pads of their feet, and there would be a panel in the room that they could press, but the panel itself didn't actually stop the shocks from happening. And then there's a third group, and in that third group, the dogs were also given shocks, but the panel in their particular environment would stop the shocks from happening. So in the first phase of this experiment, you were either in the no shock at all group, you were in the shock group that you can get out of, or the dogs were in a shock group that they could escape by pushing a panel. That's the first part of this experiment. So in the second phase of that experiment, they were put in a shuttle box, and there was a small barrier in the shuttle box where one side was electrified and the other side was not. So if they jumped across the barrier, they would avoid the shock. But because in the original phase, the first phase, the shocks were random, the dogs never really knew when the shocks were coming. So in this classical conditioning experiment, you now introduce a new neutral thing that lets them know what's about to happen. So in this particular experiment, it was a light. So this light would come on, and they would have a certain amount of time between the light coming on and jumping to the other side for the light to go off, and they never experience the shock. So for them, the light becomes a signal that they need to jump to avoid the shock. And the light would go off if they jumped and avoided the shock. Now what they found was dogs who, one, were not introduced to any shocks would frequently jump over the barrier to avoid the shocks. They also found that dogs who were able to press panels to stop the shocks from happening in the original phase, in the first phase, would also jump to the other side of the box to escape the shocks. But the dogs that were in the inescapable group, the light would come on and they would just be passive. They wouldn't respond to it. They would sit there and take the shocks until it went away. So they were not able to be conditioned to see the light as a way of changing their behaviors, and they attributed this behavior to learned helplessness or learned hopelessness in the dogs. And they eventually did these experiments in multiple ways and in changing how the patterns of introducing the shocks, and in each of those changes, if the dogs were introduced to the shock in the first phase where they couldn't escape it, they always had that same learned helplessness or learned hopelessness response to being in that shuttle box or when they're able to avoid the situation. And they eventually tested it on humans, and humans responded the same way. So this led researchers to understand that even in humans, when we have adverse experiences, when we have multiple adverse experiences, our chances or our likelihood to feel like we have the ability to control the outcome of certain situations diminishes. So this is why you may sometimes see individuals in harmful or adversive or painful situations, whether at work or in relationships or in families, and they continue to have this numbness to it, is because they've learned that over time that their behavior, regardless of whatever it is, whatever they do to try to avoid this negative outcome, nothing they did could avoid that negative outcome. That whatever aversive experience was going to happen, happened. Now, there were 3 key elements that signified that someone had some level of learned helplessness. So that first one is motivation to act. So were you less motivated to do something different because you felt like nothing would happen? That second key element is cognitions, or your thoughts. Your thoughts about your behavior and those behaviors affect on the outcome. In most cases, when someone has learned helplessness, they feel like regardless of whatever behavior they display, the outcome will happen regardless of however they behave. And that third component is passivity or numbness. So after repeated exposures to adverse experiences or negative experiences, you start to take a passive approach to these experiences happening again, or you start to become numb to the negative experiences that you're feeling in your emotions, in your body when these things happen. So how do you combat this? Now, they actually did a study on dogs and trying to alleviate the learned helplessness. And what they found is that if they showed the dogs multiple times that by jumping to the other side, they can escape the shocks, the dogs eventually learned that I just need to jump or I just need to move and I can escape this process. It took them multiple trials to get those dogs to learn that my behavior can affect the outcomes that happen. It's similar to that saying that we sometimes have, that one negative event requires 5 positives to override that negative experience. So when we have these experiences, or when we have repeated experiences, sometimes we may need guidance to learn that, yes, if I take this action, this may change the outcome, but I have to continue to do this. If I continue to take this action, then I have more control and I have more ability to manage my situation. And then I start to learn that my behavior does impact the outcome of certain situations, but that is done through experiences. And that's where therapy in this case can be helpful, because you can learn how, or you can start to unlearn these conditioned experiences, and you can start to relearn how to see your successes as a function of your behavior. I have multiple clients that will say to me when I highlight their successes that that's nothing. That's what I was supposed to do. Or, I mean, it doesn't matter either way. Like, it was going to happen that way either way. It takes multiple intervals of you being able to learn how to highlight your behaviors as the reason for your success in order to change this internal narrative that I have absolutely no control over my external environment. So I know I talked a lot today about like experiments, and I kind of geeked out a little bit on the experiment. I love behavioral work, but I'll try not to geek out as much the next time. But what I hope you learn from today's video is that, yes, if you repeatedly experience negative and adverse experiences that are outside of your control or beyond your control, you may develop learned helplessness. Because you may learn that regardless of how you behave in these situations, that your behavior does not control what happens. And in order to alleviate that learned helplessness, it may require some level of assistance from someone helping you see what are alternative solutions to the problems that are happening, and start to see how your behavior contributes to your success and or failure. Highlighting that helps you alleviate that learned helplessness, because you relearn that my behavior does matter in these situations. I do have power or control in certain environments to determine how successful I am in these situations or how unsuccessful I am in these situations. And it's different for children, because there is a power dynamic with parents and children, and that's a different discussion. But this is for adults. in adults, in most situations, outside of abusive situations. And sometimes even in those abusive situations, there are things that are within your power and your control that you may not be able to see as solutions because of the experiences you've had. So you have that learned helplessness because you don't see alternatives. And having someone, therapist, coach, mentor, who's able to guide you to those alternative solutions, or who's able to show you alternative options and reinforcing you that you behaving in this way is what resulted in that success, is what's ultimately going to be helpful in those situations. So, as always, I hope you learned something from today's video. I want you to take the time to jot down any thoughts or questions or comments you have below. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.